Black Ewe, White Lamb by Elowen Greaves. Read by Elspeth Sauer. It was at dinner, one fog-sunk evening in November, that her name returned to me. The place was the Montpellier Club, a narrow establishment off Pall Mall, where the fireplaces were too small and the port too fine. I had arrived late to find Calloway already seated, coat unbuttoned, spectacles fogged, nursing the last inch of a bottle he had no intention of sharing. We were joined shortly by a solicitor of indeterminate age and a naval historian with a voice like wet coal. The conversation moved, as it often does in such places, from grievances in committee to legacies left improperly managed. It was when someone mentioned the vague legal category of unentailed gifts of habitation that Calloway gave a slight snort and said, "That sounds like Miss Topham's business." The name stirred something, not quite recognition, more a pause in the fabric of thought. I could not have described her face, and yet I was sure I had known it. "Topham," I repeated, testing the weight of it. "Not Margaret Topham, surely?" "The very same," he said, not looking up. "Took a house somewhere out toward the Western Downs. Wiltshire, I believe. Inherited it from some mad uncle or cousin. No brothers, of course. Dreadful old property. She went out in October and stayed the winter alone. Not a soul with her, except the housekeeper, who promptly took ill." "What happened?" Calloway only shrugged and reached for the bread knife. "She wrote a letter, just the one, but it was enough to make the fellow who received it insist she never write another." That was all he said. And though the table meandered into other topics, into the comparative integrity of Greek and Roman wills, and whether Kent was ever truly haunted, I remained turned inward, the name Topham circling back through memory like a heron before descent. In the days that followed, I found myself recollecting fragments without meaning to, a brief conversation in the portico of a museum, a reading list penciled in a margin not my own, a laugh, dry, reserved, heard once in a Bodleian anteroom. These scraps, insignificant alone, formed a shape when taken together. Miss Margaret Topham had, at some point in the past decade, drifted along the margins of my acquaintance like a thread just loose enough to pull free. I made no effort to contact her, but that winter, by odd coincidence or some quieter agency, I came across a record, an auction list from the estate of a gentleman antiquarian in Frome, which included her name in a footnote. She had, apparently, inherited Ashbrook House the previous year. The man in question, one Harold L. Winton, had been a collector of curious ephemera and had once lodged there as a boy. He noted the property in a marginalia heavy letter to a colleague, speaking vaguely of the wood that sings in frost and the room that locks itself, not from mischief, but from memory. There was nothing directly alarming in this, but the phrasing stayed with me, and though I told myself often that the world offers no shortage of haunted cottages and ancient books, I began to feel, as some do, upon hearing a tune they cannot name, that I was brushing the edge of something not quite remembered. It was not until some months later that I came into possession of the full account. It was not a manuscript, or a confession, or anything so direct. Rather, it was a series of annotated letters, household inventories, and one curious transcription, enclosed anonymously in a package sent to the rooms I keep on Red Lion Square. I can only surmise that the sender was Miss Topham herself, having heard word of my inquiries, thinking it best to satiate me as a means to stop any further circulation of a tale she might prefer not widely known. What follows is, as nearly as I can assemble it, the true shape of that winter and of Miss Topham's time at Ashbrook. Margaret Topham arrived at Ashbrook House on a cold afternoon in late October of 1887. The carriage that brought her from the station made slow work of the final mile, where the lane narrowed between hedgerows and dipped beneath bare-limbed oaks. The house came into view without ceremony, its slate roof glistening faintly beneath the last mist of the day. She'd seen the house once before, years ago, when her uncle still lived, and the place was better tended. Now the paint flaked from the shutters, ivy had climbed to the chimneys, and the gravel drive wore moss like a thin green shawl. But the house stood, and it was hers. At the porch, she was greeted not by the housekeeper, Mrs. Fletcher, who was already laid up with a sudden fever, but by the gardener's son, a quiet lad of perhaps 17, who took her small trunk and carried it inside without speech. The front hall smelled faintly of damp plaster, and the sharpness of beeswax polish long set into the floorboards. Light filtered through the coloured panes above the door, throwing a faint pattern onto the stairwell. Margaret stood a moment longer than necessary before removing her gloves. The air inside was still, though not cold, as if the house had paused its breathing upon her arrival. She made her way into the library first, not by design, but by habit. Even before the fire had been laid in her bedroom, even before a proper meal, she drifted to the one room she had long associated with the idea of Ashbrook itself. The library occupied the southwest corner of the house, its tall windows half obscured by the dark fingers of a yew tree that had grown up unpruned against the stone. Within, the shelves stood much as they had when her uncle lived. Rows of leather bindings, dusty glass-fronted cases, and a central desk still scattered with his unfinished correspondence. It was there, on the desk, unassuming and neither displayed nor concealed, that she first noticed the Psalter. The volume sat atop a stack of estate ledgers, its binding modest, calfskin darkened with age, the corners reinforced in an older style of brasswork that suggested some ecclesiastical origin. The leather bore no title, only a small worn cross stamped into the lower corner of the front cover. Margaret did not open it at once. Something about its presence on the desk, as if left mid-use, gave her pause. She set her fingers lightly on the cover and noted how cool it felt beneath her hand, as though it retained a chill apart from the room's quiet warmth. Later that evening, after the fire had been built up in the hearth and a tray of broth left at her door, she returned to the library. The lamps cast long amber reflections along the glass cabinet doors, and the yew tree outside swayed in the breeze, its silhouette moving like thin black arms across the wall. Only then did she open the Psalter. The text was, at first glance, as expected, Latin psalms rendered in the standard ecclesiastical hand of the late medieval period. Marginalia appeared here and there, some in faded ink, some scratched into the parchment itself, suggesting centuries of private use beyond the choir stall. A few wormholes pierced entire gatherings of pages, leaving tiny dark tunnels where the paper had been consumed. It was only as she turned to the latter third of the book that she noticed the carving. Unlike the marginal notes, this was deliberate, formal, a funerary hymn incised not with ink, but by knife or stylus into the parchment itself. Each letter hollowed slightly deeper than the surrounding text, the strokes sharp and precise, yet bearing a faint irregularity, as if completed over several sessions. The heading read simply, In Memoriam, Agnus Albus sub taxo nigro, the white lamb beneath the black yew. Beneath it, the hymn continued for several stanzas, though the Latin grew increasingly corrupted in its grammar and phrasing, as though slipping gradually from liturgical formality into something older, less easily translated. Margaret frowned as her eyes followed the text. The hollowed letters caught the lamplight strangely, casting small shadows within their own depth, so that the hymn seemed to tremble faintly on the page as she read. The further she read, the more the rhythm of the hymn disquieted her. Though the words were technically familiar, invocations of sleep, of the folding of flesh beneath earth, of awaiting the mercy of judgment, there was an undercurrent she could not name. Something about the phrasing suggested not comfort, but concession, as though the soul in question were being surrendered not to rest, but to something watching. A peculiar construction appeared midway through one stanza. Non dormie in domini sinu, sed vigilabit sub radicibus, which she rendered after some puzzled moments as, It shall not sleep in the bosom of the Lord, but shall keep vigil beneath the roots. Roots, and beneath the roots the black yew. She sat back, the creak of the old chair sounding sharper in the hush. The fire popped behind her, and the yew's branches shifted again against the window. Margaret held the book gently. She ran her fingertips once more along the shallow gouges of the inscription. The carved words had a peculiar tactility, neither rough nor smooth, but as if the parchment itself had stiffened where it had been cut. Something about the weight of the letters made her reluctant to return the volume to the stack. Instead, she carried it with her, upstairs to the small writing desk in the chamber prepared for her. There she placed it on the desk, closed but near at hand, as though the text might soften under familiar surroundings. Outside, the wind began to rise, and with it, the branches of the yew whispered faintly along the stonework as she prepared for bed. She did not sleep easily, and when she did, her dreams carried the sound of scratching, careful, deliberate, as though someone inscribed words long after they had been spoken. The morning brought little comfort. The house, though not large, possessed that odd quality of magnifying small sounds. Floorboards shifting as though beneath unseen steps, faint ticks of contraction in the walls as the sun tried weakly to warm the stones. Margaret dressed earlier than usual and descended to the dining room, where a tray of tea and bread had been laid out, presumably by the gardener's boy. Mrs. Fletcher remained upstairs, still ailing and under the attention of the village physician, who made irregular calls from the nearby town of Warminster. The air carried the faint metallic tang of rain yet to arrive. After breakfast, Margaret returned once more to the library. The psalter remained where she had left it upon the desk in her room, but the compulsion to examine it again was strong. She carried it down with her, determined now to better understand the circumstances of its presence in the house. Her uncle's papers, scattered untidily across several drawers of the writing desk, offered little. Much concerned the maintenance of the estate, rents, livestock, legal correspondence, but tucked among a sheaf of receipts was a thin slip of folded vellum, brittle at the edges. The hand was not her uncle's, but older, with the heavy looping strokes of the previous century. Presented by the late Canon Burrows, St. Winifred's, Ashcombe, restored and retained for private devotion, 1794. Ashcombe. So here was its origin. There was, then, a church at the root of it after all. But how the psalter had come from Ashcombe to her uncle's private library, and why it bore that peculiar carved hymn, remained unanswered. As she turned the slip over, something else caught her eye. Along the lower edge, barely legible in faded ink, a line had been added in a different hand. Inscription not of our tradition. Leave undisturbed. Margaret read the note twice. She did not, as yet, fully understand its caution, but it settled into her mind with a certain weight, like the first faint tremor before a storm declares itself. That afternoon brought rain, soft but persistent, tapping against the tall windows like hesitant fingers. Margaret busied herself in the house, moving through the rooms with a kind of restless concentration, examining the inventory of what was now hers, but often finding her attention drawn back to the psalter and the words she had traced in the flickering lamplight. The yew trees, visible from nearly every western window, swayed gently under the grey sky. Their dark foliage, soaked through with rain, glistened as though lacquered. By late afternoon, with little else to distract her, she carried the psalter once more into the library and lit the lamps earlier than usual. The house, though dry, seemed to absorb the wet cold from the air, pressing close around her as the light dimmed. She opened the volume again to the carved hymn, allowing her eyes to settle into the familiar discomfort of its strange cadence. There, near the end, she noticed something she had not observed before. One of the final lines of the hymn had been altered. The incision of the letters was faintly deeper, the edges crisper, as if recut or reinforced long after the rest had been finished. The Latin was muddled, slipping now into something only half comprehensible, but she traced it slowly, reconstructing its intent. Ut agnus invocatus, descendat iterum, ut radites nutriantur in perpetuum. That the summoned lamb may descend again, that the roots be nourished forever. She stared at the words for some time, the thin blade of unease pressing closer. This was no ordinary funerary invocation. The repetition of dissent, the inversion of offering, these were not the comforting assurances of Christian repose, but something else. As she bent closer, the light from the lamp caught within the deeper grooves, making the letters shimmer faintly. For an instant, a mere trick of the eye, she told herself, she fancied she saw the smallest motion, within the hollowed strokes, as though the carved words pulsed once, imperceptibly, with breath, not her own. She closed the volume with a careful firmness and extinguished the lamps. That night, her sleep was again thin and broken, though she remembered no dreams at all. The following days passed in a pattern of increasing unease, though nothing in the house presented itself as overtly unnatural. The staff remained minimal. Mrs. Fletcher still convalesced, and the gardener's son, when seen at all, spoke only in soft monosyllables. The weather held steady in its dreariness, as if the grey itself had become a kind of ceiling above the house, lowering imperceptibly with each passing evening. Yet it was not merely the psalter that preoccupied her. She began to notice, with growing discomfort, subtle shifts in the library itself. Books she had not moved appeared slightly askew upon her return. A small brass paperweight was found in a different position upon the desk. The library door, once left ajar, was found closed in the morning. And always there was the yew. From the tall windows, the black yew tree nearest the west wall seemed to lean incrementally closer each evening, its bowed limbs pressing faintly against the leaded glass when the wind moved through. The gardener insisted it had not grown in many years, but Margaret could not free herself from the impression that it now loomed at a different angle than when she had first arrived. The strangest disturbance came near the end of her second week. She woke shortly after midnight, uncertain what had pulled her from sleep. The house was still, but a faint rhythmic sound reached her ears, a dry, deliberate rasping, like parchment being scraped with the edge of a quill. It seemed to come from below. She dressed hastily, lighting a single lamp, and descended the stairs barefoot, the boards cold beneath her feet. The sound faded as she approached the library, but when she opened the door, nothing awaited her except the quiet order of the room. The fire burned low in the grate, and the psalter resting undisturbed on the desk. Yet as she crossed the room, a faint draught whispered upward near the base of the western bookcase. The panelling there, she now recalled, had always stood slightly proud of the stone behind it. Setting the lamp upon the desk, she knelt and placed her palm to the base of the bookcase. A thin seam of colder air traced itself against her skin, as though some hidden cavity lay beyond the wall, breathing gently into the library. Margaret rose, unsettled but not frightened. Not yet. She returned to her chamber, but left the lamp burning through the remainder of the night. The following morning, with the grey light barely pressing through the low clouds, Margaret summoned the gardener's son to assist her in examining the panel. The boy, whose name was Henry, arrived dutifully, though his gaze never quite met hers. When she explained the draught, he nodded without comment, fetched a small crowbar from the tool shed, and set to work loosening the edge of the bookcase. The wood, old and dry, resisted for a time before giving way with a reluctant groan. Behind the case was a narrow void, no more than 2 feet in depth, walled with old brickwork, mottled dark with moisture. It was not a true room, nor even a proper passage, but rather a hollow, as though left deliberately unfinished during some earlier renovation. Margaret held the lamp aloft, its glow catching on the uneven surface. There, etched faintly into the brick, she saw a series of shallow carvings. They were not letters, at least not in any script she recognised. The marks curved and branched, resembling the shapes of roots or antlers, curling inward in tight repeating patterns. The grooves were worn, as though once cut deep, and softened by time and damp. Henry shifted uncomfortably behind her. "Did my uncle ever mention this space?" she asked, her voice kept low by instinct. The boy shook his head. "Never spoke of it, miss, but he didn't come to the library much, not in his later years." Margaret stepped back, allowing the lamplight to fall more fully upon the wall. In the centre of the design, barely visible beneath a faint sheen of moisture, was a small recess, a hollow no larger than her palm, cut directly into the brick. Within the recess, something glinted. Reaching carefully, she drew out a small object, a disk of some pale stone, nearly smooth, but for a spiral etched into one face. The spiral turned inward upon itself with such precision that for a moment it seemed to her eyes that it turned still, as though some depth beyond its surface waited to draw her gaze further inward. She closed her fingers around it, feeling its cold weight in her hand. The boy, watching her, shifted again. "That weren't meant to be found," he said softly. Margaret said nothing. She carried the disc back to the desk, setting it beside the psalter, where the two objects seemed, in some way she could not yet articulate, to belong together. The day passed in an odd quiet that seemed thicker than the simple stillness of country solitude. Margaret remained in the library for much of it, her work table now occupied by both the psalter and the pale disc. She examined them alternately, feeling that some silent correspondence existed between the two, as if the disc were not an ornament, but a kind of key or token belonging to the hymn inscribed into the parchment. That evening, as dusk settled once again into the folds of the house, she made a careful study of the hymn's final stanzas. The Latin, already corrupted and fragmentary, seemed to resist translation, slipping just beyond clarity. Yet certain phrases repeated themselves with unsettling persistence. Ut descendat iterum, radices nutriantur, memoriam, aeternum sub nigro. That it may descend again, that the roots be nourished, an eternal remembrance beneath the black. The black yew, always present at the edge of the house's western wall, seemed now not merely a tree, but part of a larger pattern, a participant rather than a witness. At times her eye would drift unwillingly toward the disc, its spiral still catching the lamplight in ways that suggested a motion too slow to perceive, yet impossible to dismiss. As midnight neared, and the last embers in the hearth settled into faint red pulses, Margaret felt, for the first time, a distinct unease she could not rationalise away. The library, so long her refuge, had become occupied, not by sound, nor even by movement, but by a density of attention, a presence that pressed without touch. The yew tree's silhouette shifted gently against the glass, as wind moved through its soaked branches, and beneath that faint whispering, she thought, or believed she thought, that something in the house exhaled. Not from the hearth, not from the draught behind the bookcase, from deeper still. Margaret did not open the psalter again that night. She left the disc resting atop its cover, extinguished the lamps one by one, and climbed the stairs as the house settled heavily behind her. The next morning dawned with an oppressive brightness, the clouds temporarily broken, allowing the late autumn sun to throw hard, pale beams across the windows. The effect was not cheerful. It illuminated the dust, suspended in the air, and rendered every worn edge of the old house more distinct, as though exposing details better left obscured. Margaret found herself delaying her return to the library. She breakfasted slowly, took a brief walk along the eastern hedgerow, and spoke with the physician who had come again to check on Mrs. Fletcher. The housekeeper's condition remained unchanged. A low fever, a kind of languor, neither improving nor worsening. The doctor, an old man with little patience for mystery, suggested rest and left after taking a small glass of sherry in the drawing-room. Only as the afternoon shadows lengthened did Margaret finally return to the library. The psalter and the disc remained precisely where she had left them, but she could not shake the feeling that the room itself had shifted minutely during her absence. She seated herself at the desk and opened a small notebook in which she had begun to record translations and observations. The disc she left undisturbed for the moment. She wrote for some time, trying to impose structure upon the fragmented Latin, as though rational arrangement might drive off the uneasy atmosphere that had begun to pervade her thoughts. As the light failed and she reached for the lamp, her pen faltered mid-stroke. A faint tremor vibrated through the floorboards beneath her feet, not sharp, like the jolt of passing carts, but a slow, rolling sensation, as though some enormous wheel had turned far beneath the house. It ceased as quickly as it had come, leaving only the faint ringing of the glass chimneys on the lamps. Margaret rose and crossed to the window. The yew stood as before, unmoved except for the smallest stirring of its high branches, yet she felt, with cold certainty that something beneath it had shifted or risen slightly, as if pressing toward the surface. Her eyes lowered to the grass below the window. There, at the base of the trunk where rainwater gathered, she thought she saw, not clearly, not unmistakably, but enough, a faint circle of disturbed earth, as though the ground itself had drawn a breath. She stepped back from the window and closed the heavy drapes with a firm tug. The lamplight wavered briefly as the room sealed itself against the dark. Margaret returned to the desk, her heart steady, though her hands now trembled slightly as they hovered above the Psalter's carved pages. She would not open the book again tonight. The next day brought with it a visitor, unexpected but not unwelcome. Mr. Stephen Allerton, a cousin several times removed, had written weeks earlier expressing polite interest in the state of the house, and now arrived unannounced, carried by a trap from the village station. He was of the sort often produced by minor branches of respectable families, moderately educated, cautiously curious, and practised at the art of not overstaying his welcome. Margaret greeted him in the drawing-room, where the fire had been lit against the deepening chill of late November. After the usual pleasantries, they spoke of the house, its repairs, the garden, and the isolation that accompanied winter in such a place. Only after some time did Mr. Allerton glance toward the door that led to the library and remark, "You've the old collection still, I gather. Your uncle was said to have had certain peculiar volumes." Margaret smiled faintly. Peculiar, perhaps, but largely dulled. Ledgers, sermons, the usual, though one volume remained somewhat worth special note. She spoke with deliberate caution, uncertain whether to invite further conversation. Yet Allerton leaned forward slightly, sensing perhaps some undercurrent beneath her reserve. "I've heard," he said, lowering his voice almost conspiratorially, and betraying he knew much more than Margaret perhaps expected, that Ashcombe itself had certain rites, survivals, you might say, vestiges from before the old church settled things properly. Margaret's expression remained composed, though her pulse quickened. "And who told you that?" "An idle remark, nothing more. One hears such things in the clubs. Something about the black yew trees planted near sites of older gatherings. Protective or binding, depending on who you ask." He paused, then smiled with professional detachment. "Of course, most of it's nonsense." The fire cracked behind them, sending a brief shower of sparks upward. Margaret let the silence stretch before replying. "Nonsense, yes, but persistent nonsense can be troublesome in its way." Allerton looked as though he might pursue the matter further, but instead reached for his glass and changed the subject. That night, after he had retired to the guest chamber and the house had settled into its usual quiet, Margaret found herself once again in the library, standing before the desk. The Psalter lay closed. The disc, however, she now noticed, had shifted, just slightly, its edge no longer perfectly aligned with the book beneath it. She had not touched it since the day she placed it there. Margaret stood for a long moment, her hand hovering above the disc, as though unsure whether contact would invite something she could not dismiss again. The air in the library seemed denser tonight, not heavy as before, but rather attentive. She finally withdrew her hand, and instead settled into the armchair beside the hearth, lighting only the smallest reading lamp. The room held itself around her in a kind of suspended stillness, like a held breath. From the upper floors, the faint creak of settling timbers marked Allerton's movement as he retired, but beneath those expected sounds, Margaret discerned something else, a low, rhythmic murmur, barely at the edge of hearing. It was not speech, nor any recognisable vibration, but rather a slow oscillation, pulsing gently, as though some concealed mechanism beneath the stone were breathing through the structure of the house itself. She shut her eyes, listening carefully. The sound did not originate from the walls or floors, but seemed instead to rise through the very air. The longer she listened, the more she sensed it carried a cadence, a suggestion of distant chanting submerged beneath layers of silence. Her thoughts returned involuntarily to the hymn carved into the Psalter, the verses that had slipped into broken, troubling cadences. She could not reproduce them perfectly in her mind, but the repetitions echoed faintly in her memory. Descend again, nourish the roots, remembrance beneath. Suddenly, a sharp knock interrupted the stillness. It was not at the door, but within the wall. 3 short, deliberate strikes, as if made by a careful hand upon hollow wood. Margaret rose and crossed the room with cautious steps. She traced her fingers along the panelling where the hidden cavity had been revealed days earlier. The narrow void gaped slightly, cool air whispering through the opening. The disc remained on the desk behind her, its spiral glinting faintly in the lamplight. Then she heard it again, a 4th knock, slower this time, deliberate. Margaret withdrew from the wall and extinguished the lamp in a single, steady motion. She stood in the dark a moment longer, until even the faint pulsing fell back into silence. Only then did she leave the library and ascend the stairs, careful not to disturb the hush that now seemed to breathe along with the house itself. The next morning brought a brittle calm. The rain had ceased, and with it the usual shifting of branches against the windows. The yew trees stood motionless beneath a thin white sky, their black needles glistening as though lacquered anew. At breakfast, Allerton was uncharacteristically subdued. He avoided the subject of the library altogether, speaking instead of railway schedules, recent debates in the House, and trivialities of London society. Margaret answered politely, but with little attention. Her mind remained in the library, beneath the floorboards, behind the walls. When Allerton departed that afternoon, citing the early onset of fog along the line, Margaret watched the trap carry him down the long drive without regret. The house felt less divided now, as though some subtle contest of presence had been resolved in favour of its older occupant. By late evening, Margaret returned once more to the library, as though drawn by slow inevitability. The psalter remained closed upon the desk, the disc now perfectly centred atop its cover. Whether it had shifted again by unseen hands or by some quiet breathing of the house itself, she could not say. She lit the lamp, but only dimly, letting the edges of the room dissolve into soft shadow. Her gaze lingered upon the disc's spiral, its curve pulling inward, with that unsettling precision she had come to both dread and expect. She seated herself and reached for her notebook, intending to copy the inscription anew. But before she could set pen to page, the quiet shifted. It was not a sound, precisely, more an absence of sound elsewhere. The fire ceased its usual whisper, the faint tick of the clock halted, even the ever-present creak of timber withdrew. The house was not merely silent, it had been hollowed of sound, like a bell paused between its tolls. And in that emptied stillness, she heard, without ears, without vibration, a voice, not in Latin, nor in any language she recognised. But she understood, a kind of invitation, or perhaps a recognition. The spiral gleamed softly in the low light, and for the briefest moment, Margaret felt the air press inward, as though the house itself leaned closer to listen alongside her. Then, as quickly as it had come, the sensation dissolved. The fire crackled anew, the clock resumed its faint ticking, and the ordinary hush of Ashbrook returned. Margaret lowered her pen and closed the notebook without writing a word. The following days passed with a strange calm, as though the house had retreated from whatever threshold it had briefly approached. No further knocking disturbed the walls. The rhythmic pulses beneath the floor ceased. Even the yew trees stood still beneath a stretch of cold, bright days, their dark limbs unmoved by the occasional wind. Yet Margaret knew the quiet was not permanent. It was a waiting, not a retreat. She found herself increasingly drawn to the psalter, though she rarely opened it now. Instead, she studied the disc, tracing the spiral lightly with her fingertip, feeling the subtle grooves guide her touch inward. She sensed, not through reason, but through some deeper instinct, that to follow it too far would be to cross a line she could not easily return from. It was during one such evening that she made her decision. The house was hers, but not everything within it belonged to her. Some inheritances, she understood now, extended beyond legal right or blood. The following morning, She summoned Henry to the library. "I need the earth and stones beneath the yew disturbed," she said simply. He stared at her uncertain. "Miss." "Not the tree itself. The ground beneath. There's a hollow there. I believe something was left buried." The boy hesitated only briefly before nodding. "As you say, miss." By noon the work began. Henry brought tools from the shed and set about carefully removing the damp earth beneath the yew's broad trunk. Margaret stood at a distance, watching as layer by layer was peeled away. The soil gave way easily at first, but soon resisted, thick with old roots and stones. Then, as the spade struck something hollow, a dull wooden note rang out. Together, they uncovered a small coffer, blackened oak bound in corroded iron, its surface marked with faint curling lines, not unlike those carved behind the library's panelling. Margaret dismissed Henry then, thanking him with a quiet firmness that brooked no argument. She waited until his footsteps faded before kneeling beside the unearthed box. Its lock had long since rusted through. The lid opened easily beneath her hands. Inside lay only one thing, a narrow strip of vellum, stained and fragile, upon which had been written, in that same curling, uneven hand, "Ut redeat nomen servatur," that it may return, let the name be preserved. Beneath the text, drawn carefully in faded red ink, was the spiral, identical to the one etched upon the disc. Margaret closed the box slowly, her breath steady, her pulse louder now than the wind in the branches overhead. She knew then what the Psalter had been, not a simple text of devotion, but a vessel, a keeping place for the name, a shelter for its memory, and that memory had not forgotten its shape. Margaret returned the coffer to the hollow in the ground, but did not replace the soil. She left it exposed beneath the yew's roots, as though bringing it into the open light might deny it further concealment. That night, as the house settled once more into its uneasy quiet, Margaret sat alone in the library beside the low-burning fire. The disc and psalter remained before her on the desk, but she did not touch them. Instead, she allowed her thoughts to pass through the long thread of events that had led her here. The peculiar inheritance, the carved hymn, the hollowed wall, the whispered pulse of soundless pressure beneath the house. And beneath it all, that repeated invocation, that it may return, that the roots be nourished, that the name be preserved. Whatever rite had been performed, however many generations earlier, its residue remained in these objects, in the house, in the very earth beneath the yew. A ritual not of protection, but of binding. Not an evil, precisely. Not, as she would name, evil, but something ancient, colder, and entirely outside the prayers of ordinary men. For the first time, she considered that the silence she had felt pressing upon her in the library had not been a threat, but a negotiation. The thing, whatever it was, did not seek her harm. It merely sought its own continuity. The spiral was not a summoning, but a record. And so she made her decision. She fetched a sheet of clean vellum from her uncle's supplies, lit the writing lamp, and carefully copied the spiral onto its surface, stroke for careful stroke. The shape was simple in appearance, but demanded precision. Each curve, each narrowing of the coil, each fractional descent toward the unseen centre held weight. When she finished, she placed the new vellum within the psalter, pressing it gently between two blank leaves near the back of the volume. The disc she carried back to the hollow beneath the yew, placing it alongside the old coffer. Then, standing there beneath the skeletal branches in the faint starlight, she whispered, though to whom she could not say, "It is enough." Only now did she realise she was not entirely alone. She noticed then, plain against the night, a small white lamb. He commanded dignity rather than the adoration or softness such a creature might normally. He regarded her for a moment, as if giving a small salutation of acknowledgement, if not full thanks, then walked off slowly. She did not bother to follow. This was not, she knew, a local farmer's livestock escaped. It was memory, allowed once more to speak on the wind. And as the wind moved softly through the black needles, the ground beneath her feet seemed, for the first time in many nights, entirely still. I heard little more of Miss Topham in the years that followed. When her name did surface, it was in brief and passing ways, a mention in the course of a luncheon conversation, or a note of her return to town published discreetly among the smaller items of society columns. She had let Ashbrook House to tenants, so I was told, and resumed a quieter life in the city, neither emboldened nor diminished by her season of solitude. There was no scandal attached to her, nor any illness or calamity that might provoke speculation. If anything lingered from her time at Ashbrook, it lingered in silence, as certain experiences do, becoming not the stuff of confession, but of private understanding. The house itself remains, I am told, much as it was, the yews still standing black against the western wall, the library undisturbed, and somewhere upon those shelves, the psalter lying quietly among its neighbours. And within it, no doubt, still rests the record of that winter's work, the hymn carved deep, the spiral carefully redrawn, and beneath both, the name that was never entirely forgotten.